Dean Martin was halfway through his second show at the Sands when something unusual stirred in the back of the room. Three men in dark suits sat silently, their attention fixed entirely on him, as if the applause and laughter of the crowd were invisible. You can imagine that feeling, the subtle tension of being watched, knowing instinctively that these weren't ordinary spectators. In Las Vegas, 1962, that kind of scrutiny rarely meant anything good. But here's what made Dean different. He had spent years performing under pressure, learning to read people not just with his eyes, but with a quiet awareness that others overlooked. When he finally retreated to his dressing room, the sanctuary where he could shed the stage persona and simply be himself, those same three figures followed, closing the door behind them. Most men in that situation would have stiffened, panicked, or tried to find a way out. Not Dean. He continued removing his cufflinks with steady hands, his calm almost audacious. There was no sudden movement, no overt reaction, just an unshakable presence. And in that pause, in that deliberate composure, the question hung in the air, unspoken yet electric. How does a man maintain absolute control when danger is standing inches away and everyone expects him to falter? Vegas in 1962 was a city of contrasts, a place where glittering lights masked shadows far darker than most visitors ever imagined. The Strip hummed with the excitement of showgirls, high-stakes gamblers, and the endless clinking of coins. But behind the spectacle ran a hidden current of power, influence, and risk that could touch anyone who caught the wrong attention. It was a city built on charm and danger in equal measure, a place where deals were made in whispers and threats often went unspoken, yet were understood by all who knew how to read the room. Dean Martin had come to know this world intimately, not by seeking its darkness, but by navigating it with a keen awareness that many never possessed. He wasn't just a performer, he was a professional who had worked his way up from small-town nightclubs, learning the rhythm of the crowd, the language of influence, and the subtle codes of survival. Every smile, every joke, every gesture on stage was both an offering and a shield, a way to disarm audiences while maintaining complete control of his presence. In a town where others bent or broke under pressure, Dean moved through life with an ease that appeared effortless, but was the product of years of observation and careful practice. People didn't just admire him for his voice or his charm. They recognized a certain intelligence beneath the surface, a calm that suggested he understood more than he revealed. That calm, however, was never complacent. It was a kind of strategic awareness, a readiness to act without panic, to assess danger without being consumed by it. When the mob's presence became a factor, when the uninvited and the dangerous entered his orbit, Dean didn't react out of fear or bravado. Instead, he relied on the same principles that had guided him through every stage, every performance, every negotiation in the murky world of Las Vegas entertainment. His reputation as a man who was charming yet unshakable, approachable yet discerning, allowed him to command respect without ever raising his voice, without ever needing to prove strength through force. It was a balance few could achieve, and it made him uniquely equipped to handle situations that would terrify ordinary men. The city around him seemed to pulse with potential for both brilliance and catastrophe, and Dean understood that success depended not only on talent, but on perception, timing, and the ability to read intentions beneath polished exteriors. He carried himself like someone who had learned the rules of engagement in a city where appearances were everything and consequences could be immediate. Every handshake, every glance, every pause in conversation was calibrated to convey confidence and control, to signal that while he was part of this world, he was not beholden to it. In Vegas, where alliances shifted and power was both visible and invisible, Dean's calm professionalism was his armor, his reputation both shield and key. Understanding the city, its rhythms, and its hidden rules allowed him to survive and thrive, to navigate moments of unseen threat with the same casual charm he brought to every performance, leaving those who underestimated him surprised, unprepared, and ultimately outmaneuvered. Dean Martin had performed countless shows, yet something about the crowd that night felt off. From his vantage point on stage, he noticed them. 3 men seated together, their suits dark and unremarkable, but their focus absolute. They weren't laughing at the jokes, they weren't responding to the music, and they weren't even clinking glasses with the rest of the patrons. Their eyes tracked him with a steady intensity that seemed almost unnatural, as though they were measuring every movement, every pause, every expression. Have you ever felt that sensation, that subtle weight of being watched, where awareness sharpens, instincts flare, and ordinary moments acquire gravity? That was Dean's reality in those minutes, and yet he didn't show it. He smiled, bantered, and delivered each note as though nothing was amiss, because showing alarm would be to concede control. The tension in the room was invisible to everyone else, yet tangible to him, a micro-tension that tightened like a string with every song. Who were these men, and why had they chosen him? That question lingered, unspoken, creating a suspense that hovered just beneath the surface. Dean had learned that in situations like this, patience and observation were as valuable as courage. He watched the subtle cues, a shift in posture, a glance exchanged between them, the way they lingered on details most would ignore. Each observation added a layer of understanding, a puzzle that demanded careful decoding. In a city built on performance, charm, and hidden agendas, recognizing the difference between audience and observer was a skill few mastered. Dean recognized it instantly, and he allowed the tension to accumulate without rushing to resolve it, understanding that the true advantage lay not in reaction, but in awareness. Could he have felt fear? Perhaps, but it was tempered by experience, by the calm assurance of someone who knew that composure alone could alter outcomes. The audience, unaware of the danger, applauded and laughed, yet Dean carried a dual consciousness, performer and strategist, entertainer and evaluator, charm and caution intertwined. It's in these delicate balances, in the ability to notice and interpret without overreacting, that power is quietly asserted. By the time the final notes of his set rang out, the 3 men had made their intentions clear simply through presence, leaving Dean with the choice of how to respond. It was a decision that required the same precision he used in every performance, the same clarity he relied on in every negotiation, and the same inner calm that had carried him through a lifetime of unseen tests. The question remained, when the confrontation came, would he maintain the delicate equilibrium that had allowed him to survive countless unseen pressures, or would the tension finally demand an overt display of control? For Dean Martin, every choice was an extension of the persona he cultivated and the instincts he honed, and in that moment, those instincts whispered louder than fear ever could.
Dean didn't raise his voice when they stepped inside. He didn't need to. 3 men filled the room with the kind of silence that presses on your chest, suits stiff, eyes measuring corners, hands resting where hands don't need to rest. Most people would shrink. Dean smiled, the same relaxed smile he wore on stage, and asked if anyone wanted a drink. That alone cracked the rhythm. When someone expects fear and gets hospitality, their script stumbles. One of the men leaned forward, letting the threat hang in the air, talking about favors owed and respect demanded. Dean listened, nodding, not interrupting, letting the words run out of oxygen on their own. Then he spoke, softly, with humor edged like a blade. He said he understood respect, that he'd built a career on it, but respect worked best when it was mutual. He gestured around the room, the mirrors, the quiet, the door. This was his space, not loudly, not defensively, just stated. The men shifted. Authority doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits down and waits. Dean's body stayed loose, shoulders open, eyes kind. He cracked a joke about timing, about how even tough guys knew better than to interrupt a show. Laughter is a pattern interrupt, and one of them laughed before catching himself. They tried again, harder this time, voices sharpening, the implication clearer. Dean didn't match the heat. He lowered it. He asked a question instead. What would happen, he wondered aloud, if word got around that his dressing room was a place for shakedowns? Would that help anyone? He wasn't threatening. He was forecasting. People with power thinking outcomes, not impulses. The contrast did the work for him. Calm against pressure, wit against menace. Suddenly the room felt smaller for the men who came to dominate it. Dean leaned back, crossed his legs, and told a story about starting out broke, about learning which rooms you walk into quietly and which you own by being yourself. It was relatable, disarming, and it reframed the moment. He wasn't a target. He was a peer with leverage. You could see it land. The tallest man exhaled. Another adjusted his tie. Dean offered that drink again, like nothing was wrong, like the decision had already been made. And that's the lesson you're meant to take. When pressure shows up, who do you become? Do you borrow someone else's fear, or do you anchor in who you are? Dean didn't win by being tougher. He won by being clearer. He respected himself first, and the room followed. When they left, it wasn't with apologies or threats, just a quiet understanding. The door closed, and Dean returned to his mirror, calm intact, power untouched. Moments like that remind you that strength isn't volume, it's alignment. When your identity is settled, intimidation loses its grip. You don't need to win loudly. You just need to be unmistakable, steady, and present long enough for the truth to do its quiet work. Dean didn't reach for the phone to escalate. He reached for it to settle the air. That distinction matters. Power that panics calls for backup. Power that understands itself calls for alignment. He let the silence breathe, then dialed a number everyone in that room recognized without hearing it spoken. No names announced, no explanations offered, just a casual, almost bored request to speak to Frank. You could feel the temperature shift, not because of fear, but because certainty had entered the room. While the line rang, Dean stayed relaxed, making small talk, asking one of the men if he'd ever caught a late show in Vegas. It wasn't stalling, it was signaling. When you're truly connected, you don't rush to prove it. The men watched his face instead of his hands now. Their leverage was evaporating in real time. The call connected, and Dean's tone didn't change. Same warmth, same ease. He joked, said he hoped he wasn't interrupting dinner, then casually mentioned the company he had. He didn't ask for rescue. That's the genius. He framed it as information, not a plea. Frank listened, understood immediately, and responded with a few calm words that never needed repeating. Dean smiled, thanked him, and hung up. No dramatics, no victory lap, just a quiet end to a loud problem. The men knew what that call represented, not muscle, but network, not threat, but consequence. And here's where the shift happens. The room no longer belonged to intimidation. It belonged to clarity. The mobsters softened, not because they were defeated, but because the game had changed. Dean had reminded them, without saying it outright, that influence travels through people, not fists. He'd placed himself inside a web they couldn't cut without cutting themselves. That's authority at its most elegant. Think about how often pressure convinces you that you're alone, that you have to handle everything with brute force or silent endurance. Dean chose a third path. He used relationship as strategy. He understood that knowing who to call is often more powerful than knowing what to say, and he waited until the exact moment when the call would land hardest. When the men finally stood to leave, there was no hostility left to carry out with them, just acknowledgement. Dean wished them well, genuinely, and meant it, because when you resolve conflict from a place of strength, you don't need to humiliate anyone. You simply close the loop. That call wasn't about Frank Sinatra. It was about identity. Dean knew who he was connected to, and more importantly, who he was. When you remember that, pressure loses its urgency. You stop reacting and start choosing. And in that choice,
Danger turns into distance, tension turns into respect, and you walk away unchanged while everything else rearranges itself around you. That is the quiet satisfaction, the payoff you feel when foresight replaces fear and authority replaces chaos, leaving you steadier, safer, and unmistakably in control without ever raising your voice once. After the call, nothing exploded. That was the point. The real consequence showed up quietly, in the way doors opened a second faster, in the way conversation softened when Dean entered a room. People didn't talk about what happened, but they adjusted around it. In Vegas, silence is information, and Dean had just sent a message without ever sending one. He kept performing,
Kept laughing, kept being himself. And that consistency told everyone watching that the situation hadn't shaken him. Promoters treated him with a slightly different tone, more careful, more respectful, not afraid, just aware. Social invitations shifted too. He was still welcome everywhere, but now there was an understanding that he wasn't someone to test. That kind of reputation isn't built on force, it's built on discernment. Dean had demonstrated that he knew how to navigate pressure without creating mess, and in a town built on fragile alliances, that skill travels fast. What's interesting is what didn't change. Dean didn't posture. He didn't reference the incident. He didn't dine out on the story. That restraint was part of the power. When you don't need credit, people give you more of it. When you don't retell the moment, it grows larger in other people's minds. The absence of drama became the drama, and that's how subtle influence works. Over time, the men who once tried to corner him became distant but polite. Paths crossed, nods were exchanged, boundaries were respected. No revenge, no alliance, just equilibrium. Dean had turned a potential threat into a settled fact of life. He'd proven that he could protect his space without poisoning the well, and that made him safer in the long run than any public show of dominance ever could. Think about how this lands in your own life. After a hard moment, do you rush to explain yourself, or do you let your composure speak? Dean understood that the aftermath is where identity is locked in. Anyone can be clever under pressure. Few people can remain grounded after the pressure passes. He chose continuity over celebration. That choice echoed through his career. He became someone people trusted with proximity, with privacy, with sensitive rooms and delicate conversations. Trust is the real currency, and Dean had just increased his balance without anyone seeing the transaction. Sometimes the quietest resolution reshapes futures more deeply than any loud victory ever could, truly lasting power. Dean's story lingers because it isn't about bravado, it's about choice. In the moment where fear would have been understandable, he chose presence. Where ego could have flared, he chose clarity. That's what courage often looks like in real life, not loud or cinematic, but grounded, deliberate, and deeply human. It's the courage to stay yourself when the room is trying to tell you to become someone else. Ask yourself where you feel that pressure now. Is it at work, in a relationship, in a room where you feel smaller than you are? Most of us won't face mobsters, but we all face moments that test our spine. Dean didn't win because he was fearless. He won because he was anchored. He knew his values, his relationships, and his worth, and he let those do the talking when emotions threatened to take over. There's a quiet cleverness in that approach. He didn't escalate. He didn't submit. He reframed. He understood that power isn't just strength, it's timing, tone, and self-trust. That kind of intelligence compounds over a lifetime. It shapes how people treat you, how conflicts resolve, and how much peace you get to carry with you afterward. Cleverness under pressure isn't manipulation, it's awareness paired with restraint. What makes this story stick is how usable it is. You don't need fame or famous friends to apply it. You need the willingness to pause, to breathe, and to respond instead of react.
You need the confidence to stand in who you are, even when someone else is trying to rush you into fear. That's a skill you can practice moment by moment, choice by choice. So take a second and reflect. Where could you lead with calm instead of force? Where could you choose wit over anger, patience over panic? If this story stirred something in you, share what moment stood out or how it connects to your own life. Stories grow stronger when they're carried forward. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that strength can be quiet, pass this along. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't making noise, it's standing steady and letting the world adjust around you. That quiet steadiness, practiced daily, becomes a reputation, then a refuge, reminding you that influence earned through integrity lasts longer than fear ever does, and leaves you lighter, clearer, and more connected to yourself over time, always there.